Welcome back one more time to the third and final part of Gokaiger, the Ultimate Anniversary Season. In part 2, we fully honed in on the lead Gokaiger characters and what makes the character work done throughout the show flow so well. But it wouldn't be a complete character breakdown without digging into the opposing side of the conflict as well. Before we jump into that, however, as promised, I wanted to take some time to respond to some of your comments regarding things you wanted me to dig into a bit more, or just dig into at all. Most of said comments wanted me to hone in on more of the anniversary elements specifically, so let's do that. But, as I mentioned in part 2, my Sentai knowledge overall is likely very limited compared to many of you, the viewers, so I'm not going to be able to provide a whole paragraph on why Guy coming back matters beyond that being a neat episode in its particular context. I've seen all of Shinkenger, of course, and I have a whole 2-part review of that from many moons ago, but beyond simply being a samurai and as such a fitting challenge for Joe, having that first-hand knowledge of Kaoru doesn't really elucidate much more about Gokaiger. I have seen just enough of Megaranger where the particulars of that episode are even more special. I understand just enough about Go-Go 5 and Car Ranger to know why their episodes matter, and I have no clue why the Battle Fever J tribute is the Christmas episode. But, to address 2 other comments I saw in one go, that is an inherent advantage of Gokaiger that I also think applies differently to other anniversary seasons I've seen or have knowledge on. With Gokaiger, the onus is rarely, if ever, on you, the viewer, to come in preloaded with these deep understandings of these past characters and their past lives. Having that knowledge would likely make seeing them again even more meaningful, but the writing is rarely structured in such a way where that's a requirement. Other than the Car Ranger episodes, which very evidently lean more towards the writing sensibilities of Car Ranger, these tribute episodes are built to work with and around what Gokaiger is all about, and not the other way around. So watching it actually does serve as a neat introduction to a lot of seasons, even if it necessarily spoils the way some of them end up. It's a season where the anniversary elements do well to facilitate what the Gokaigers as a team and as a story is already about, both within and beyond the text. But if you also happen to end up liking one of the Sentai alums, then good news. There's much more of them in another show, and probably a movie or 5. So, how does that compare to other anniversaries? Glad you asked, commenter from part 1. One of the most direct comparisons I can make, since I've seen all of it as well, is Kamen Rider Geo. Now, that season divides opinion far more than Gokaiger ever did, but I think it does a very similar thing in terms of making past Rider seasons seem interesting and accessible, while also taking a lot more creative liberties with those seasons and bending some of them to its own will. And that of course tracks, seeing as the season is all about messing around with time. Kamen Rider Fourze is an anniversary season that stands as easily my favorite Toku show, assuming we're not counting PR seasons, but not a discussion I feel like getting into. It, by comparison, feels more like an anniversary specifically tied to the logic of what a next-gen story would feel like off the back of the old-school Kamen Riders specifically. There are references scattered about in every corner, yes, but its ideas on being an anniversary season are largely conceptual, and it works those ideas so very well. And no anniversary Toku has really been able to capture that unique flair before or since. And I suppose it only makes sense to talk about how all of that compares to Super Megaforce at least one more time. The idea behind both Megaforces as anniversary seasons is like a barely held together halfway house between Gokaiger's sensibilities on the matter and Fourze's. And this is because, at its core, both Megaforce and Super Megaforce are kinda sorta written as direct responses to MMPR in both tone and setting more than anything. Based on details one could charitably call happenstantial, their anniversary elements can be both creatively subtle and also somewhat vague and sometimes non-existent. It's a series that understands the spirit of what PR actually is more than what PR at times is viewed as or strives to be, however successfully. Which to me makes it at least as interesting to talk about as Gokaiger, even if I find Gokaiger to be the superior show overall. And I find the Geki Ranger tribute turned Jungle Fury tribute neat to that end, because I think both, for very different reasons, do well to represent what either show can do on their best day. Except Gokaiger does it again and again, and yeah, you get the point. I'm not exactly breaking new ground here by highlighting Gokaiger's comparative strengths. So, with our Part 3 addendum in the books, let's talk more about the other side of the conflict. Even for as simple and straightforward as most of them seem, there's a lot of interesting avenues Gokaiger takes with regards to how the Zangyak are presented. They don't ever try to present them as morally flexible, with one extremely hilarious exception, and they are certainly never presented as having a point to consider. And yet, I can't help but feel that I understood them as individuals here much more than their Western counterparts. Bizorg's deal kind of speaks for itself and does a lot for Joe, as we touched on, but the best example from where I'm standing is Warsgil himself, but specifically his demise and what that means. When he decided to personally bring the house down on the space pirates because his nutty plans kept failing, we really saw a lot of particularly engaging villain dynamics rise to the surface, in ways their interactions only ever hinted at prior to. Damaras in particular presents us with this conflicted general, a conflict that isn't especially vocal. He understands inherently that dealing with the prince is akin to babysitting, basically. In fact, everyone knows he's not especially qualified, but they need to put up with him because royalty. But that understanding also isn't used as a means of undermining the part of him that legitimately feels guilty about the prince's death. And what we end up with is a fairly complicated web of emotions where one man's feeling of failure services a number of other avenues. The most prominent of them all being that perhaps had he believed in someone he cares about more than is let on, maybe Warsgil wouldn't have been driven to extremes. And Insarin all the while is just caught in the middle where she still has to abide by and prove herself to a far more suffocating power structure while also being an advocate for her allies. But what really brings this idea together, prior to the Emperor himself taking charge of the fleet towards the tail end, is this. Despite all evidence to the contrary, including but not limited to his endless baby rage, the prince ends up not just being a good match against the Gokaigers, but the ideal antagonist for them as well. My reasoning there is twofold. Firstly, the Gokaigers aren't the only ones that are fighting a battle built on legacy. His legacy is also something the show considered, to its benefit. He too has a rather tenuous relationship with his history, and it's just too fitting that the Gokaigers can only unlock their own legendary power as a direct result of defeating his ambition. And therein lies the somewhat tragic difference. Warsgil died as a belligerent child trying so hard to play the part his father envisioned for him, exceedingly similar to Trakina on the PR side of things. His final moments with Bizorg were particularly striking, as he believed without irony or comedic flair that the only member of his crew he felt like he could open himself up to is also the most fully subjugated member of said crew, whereas it's far easier for him to project his insecurities on all the far more free-thinking folks floating around, and not necessarily without cause either. Now, we're not meant to be sad that the Zangyak are losing, they are bad people, but being people also means dealing with their own range of feelings and expectations, and I thought the angle they took there was a good one. Now, the second reason is a bit more internal than external. The ultimate fate of Warsgil comes from an environment that is diametrically opposed to what the Gokaiger team comes to embody. And this, I think, is the most important defining element of the entire conflict, and maybe even the whole season. Within the framework of this story, there is that bit of true sacrifice that this team is forced to experience, which we covered in depth during the character breakdowns. It's part of what makes half of them prickly and slow to trust the ideals others might be selling them, be them previous Sentai or not. Joe was working for the enemy at one point and had to see the pain his actions, or lack thereof at times, resulted in firsthand. Luca's sister died right in front of her because the invasion made finding basic healthcare impossible. What more could I possibly say about I'm and Marvelous? Granted, it's not as clear what Doc's damage is, other than the rather vague notion that his home was also destroyed. But all of that is also to say that the show finds the footing it needs when all of that plays out a bit more, and we're able to see some of their colder demeanors warm up, as they become something more akin to fully formed people. which, in turn, continually vindicates the dispositions of the more emotionally stable pair, in presentation at least, because without them, the crew probably would have failed or died a long time ago. But more than that, without them, the dynamics of this team just wouldn't really work. We've covered most of this in the previous parts too, but what I really want to talk about is how it all comes to a head in a specific, relatively late game episode. The Megaranger tribute episode, otherwise known as an entire 22 minutes made to cater to me, apparently, is a season highlight. And what's highlighted here, albeit in admittedly very on-the-nose ways to the point where it risks losing the plot, is that the usual grumpy trio can't just pout their way out of this one. But it actually doesn't take long for them to find themselves fully ingrained within various groups of students who all have various dreams they have no choice but to respect. It's a far cry from giving a child a morpher and essentially telling him, good luck, hope you don't die. And it still involves children as major players in a conflict that directly threatens them. And what's crazier? Aim isn't forced to apologize on behalf of anyone, which at that point, or any point in the show, is a minor miracle. And Doc just getting to nerd out and be a tutor for some tech geeks is actually enamoring to Luca, who, under normal circumstances, would not be particularly taken by most things Doc does. And I don't think it's just a byproduct of the writers wanting to make them more likable down the line for the sake of it, because the way Marv and Luca in particular react differently to Doc and Aim during various moments within the story speaks to something far more interesting. It speaks to just how much this team grew to bounce off each other, learn from each other, and take a trait or two from one or two other members as a means of self-enhancement and not self-overhaul. And as a direct result of that, bringing it all the way back to my main point, we can then see the difference between the two warring sides. Think about how obnoxiously suffocating the atmosphere is up on the Gigant horse. Consider how much all of them have to cover for their leader, and not the other way around. And then consider how the crew's need to not rock the boat only instilled further seeds of distrust and uncertainty inside War's Gill. There are many aspects that make them and Bosco very similar to the Gokai crew, but in this respect, they could not be further apart. There was a chance, a window even, the main heads of the Zangyok invading force had to perhaps exhibit some of the same traits the Gokaigers did over time, but they never allowed themselves an avenue to be truly vulnerable. They all perished one by one, never really knowing how the others felt or thought. And within that lies the idea I touched on all the way back in part 1, about how the prince and princess diverge. I explained how Aim is something of a spiritual leader of this team and helps foster an atmosphere that, at first, didn't seem all that above board. When the princess felt vulnerable and weak, when she was faced with failure and the rough reminder of the legacy she needs to live up to, completely separate of the Pink Ranger legacy she more than lives up to, at first, she wants to handle things more or less as War's Gill did when he got his own mech. But this scene is basically a living, breathing summary of everything I love most about Gokaiger. You'll note the difference between this and the comparable Bizorg scene, a robot who, by rule, cannot go against anything his boss wants, no matter how self-destructive. Even without outright saying it, Gokaiger understands that being an important family comes tied to its own legacy. So, it's easy to see what the show is trying to say about how the environments experienced by two descendants of two different ruling classes impacted their perspectives. In another universe, there's a version of this show where maybe Aim recognizes this too, and is doing what she does best for War's Gill and not against him. But even as is, I really liked it as a concept, and it's because of moments like this that I would make the case that the Gokaigers are a team of people who acknowledged each other as opposed to just being around each other, and we cannot say the same for the Zangyok. And now, at long last, let's discuss the ending arc of Gokaiger. The way this show closes up shop represents a plot trajectory I'm fond of, and if you'll allow yet another tangent, a relatively short one this time, maybe, it just so happens to present us with almost the opposite answer to the question Kamen Rider Build's finale poses. Now, this will obviously be a massive spoiler for that show, so if you haven't seen it and still want to, you've been warned. But put plainly, Build ends by way of flinging Sento and Banjo into a world where the central conflict never happened and the previously segmented nation of Japan was never segmented. Now, that all seems fine on the surface, but the reason I don't particularly like this finale, and I say that despite very much liking most of the build-up to it, pun intended, as always, is because it robs most of the characters, including the major political players, of the chance to learn an important lesson about how easily a power struggle as a preview to an arms race could literally rip the country apart. And yes, we understand that this smirky devil, Pandora's box, and the energy within are the main culprits here, so that's not an invalid counter-argument, but I choose to interpret this inciting incident far less literally. In my view, the box is a means to reveal what's possible, not change what's possible. And I think there's a much more powerful message we lose out on when we aren't forced to see these characters rebuild a world they were active participants in. And sure, the characters didn't actively make that choice, but at some point the writers did, so that's a moot point. Gokaiger takes a very different approach with their one-piece equivalent of a treasure to rule them all. They could reshape the world, essentially canceling out anything and everything the Zangyak did and restoring their planets all the while. But it would mean that the Super Sentai would all vanish, and there's no telling what that might mean in a universe that would now have a major power vacuum someone else might scoop up. Now, the optics of this are trickier because we can't really pinpoint a root cause of the Zangyak's power and the structure thereof, so we also can't say if their influence was indicative of a systemic failing elsewhere in the universe, which would necessarily change what the story would be communicating with their defeat. But there's no alternate universe where this show was going to be expected to dig into any of that. So my actual point here is this. I like that everyone has to remember what the Zangyak did, as well as everything the various Sentai teams sacrificed to stop them and their endless conquests before they simply dissolved into far less powerful factions. As a general idea, I strongly believe that history is meant to be learned from, to build up better, not erased, because that is maybe the only chance you have at ensuring that history doesn't repeat itself. And that's to say nothing of the unintended consequences that could manifest through the bending of reality. The idea of this Triforce wish-granting thingamawhatsit being somewhat vague on what a world without Sentai would be like lends itself to that idea, and in so doing creates the implication that 35 years of victories might never have happened either, which means there's a case to be made that their original enemy from all the way back in 1977 might have simply won, relatively unopposed, and the entire universe would be worse for it. And if not him, then any of the other many enemy factions to ravage the world over that same time frame. And all of that ties neatly into the idea of the Gokaigers being initially reluctant to embody a legacy they soon grow to appreciate. They are, in the now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, a unique and vital part of that legacy. At the root of Gokaiger, at the root of Sentai, even at the root of Tokusatsu and its foundations more broadly, lies the idea that these struggles and bouts should never be forgotten or erased, but remembered. All for the sake of instilling hope in those who need it, so that even when said people lose their way, and they will from time to time, there will always be a path forward. And now, also at long last, let us close the book on this obnoxiously long multi-part Gokaiger breakdown with one final anecdote. My coming to appreciate this show ended up being an amusing 180, looking back at it, because in spite of everything I can and have said about Gokaiger in the now, I initially couldn't get through a lot of the early episodes. Me finally finishing this show took 4 separate attempts after the first 3 left me shrugging my shoulders. Based solely on my initial impressions, it seemed like the fans hyping up this show to feverish heights, especially the ones demanding that I finish it, were all collectively playing a practical joke on me. But here we are, 51 episodes and a movie later, and I came to understand what many before me already did. I came to understand why so many cherish this team, all while shocking myself with how much I grew to cherish the heart of the season. I came to understand why Gokaiger is the ultimate anniversary season, a season all about growing to appreciate legacy and your place in it. And hell, I might have even gotten more out of it had I known anything about the Hurricangers or most of the other cameos that showed up. So thank you to all the Gokaiger fans, casual Gokai enjoyers, or anyone who just clicked on this video simply because I made it. And a special thank you to every one of my Discord peeps who helped me sort through some of the tussles I had putting this thing together. Bookworm and Tack were especially helpful to that end, also Quasar, Sins, Bale, and everyone else in that group chat. And one more shout out to Marco Satsu, who helped me figure out a couple questions I needed to sort through, what with him having a much bigger foundation of Sentai knowledge than I. And now that I've gotten that whole Oscars acceptance speech bit out of the way, let me know down below if you'd like an unofficial part 5 of this Gokaiger breakdown by way of the 10 Gokaiger movie. I'm planning on watching it anyway, but I want to create at least a bit of distance between that film and everything I've done here. Not just to give me a bit of a break, but also to give me the chance to miss these guys just a little bit and hopefully enhance the experience. But until then, thanks for an obscene amount of watching.